All right, let's jump right into this explainer and uncover what I like to call the secret life of verbs. If you've always thought of them as just simple doing words, well, prepare for a pretty fascinating shift in perspective. It turns out verbs are these incredibly dynamic, shape-shifting agents that genuinely power our entire language. They're basically the engines of our sentences, and understanding their advanced mechanics, that is the absolute key to unlocking really powerful, precise writing.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to explore advanced verb interactions, break down the difference between transitive and intransitive verbs, look at how active and passive voice shifts our focus, and finally, we'll expose some verbs in disguise.
Starting off with Section 1, Advanced Verb Interactions. Okay, so here's the thing. At an advanced level, we aren't just looking at isolated action words sitting alone on a page. We are analyzing this complex grammatical ecosystem where verbs reach out and literally grab other words in a sentence. They can completely change a reader's focus, or even temporarily disguise themselves as entirely different parts of speech. It's just a fascinating web of relationships.
Moving right along to Section 2, Transitive and Intransitive Verbs.
Let's tackle the first type here. When verbs transfer their action directly over to a target, we call them transitive. The action travels from the subject straight across the verb and lands directly on a receiver to make the sentence actually work. They absolutely 100% require this direct object, whether that's a person or a thing receiving the action, to make any grammatical sense at all.
Think about what happens in your brain when you just hear an incomplete phrase like, she bought. You feel that? It feels totally unresolved, right? Like you're just sitting there waiting for the other shoe to drop.
That incomplete thought instantly forces you to ask the obvious question, wait, bought what? You literally can't just buy out into thin air. The verb bought is highly transitive. It is desperately searching for an object to receive its action.
These thoughts only click into place when those transitive verbs successfully transfer their action to a direct object. She bought a car. Boom, the car receives the buying. He raised his hand receives the raising. Without a car or his hand, these actions just have nowhere to land, and the whole sentence basically falls apart.
Now on the flip side, we have intransitive verbs. Think of these as the independent loners of the grammar world. They are totally self-sufficient, they do their job describing the action, and they absolutely do not need a target to complete their meaning.
If we say, the baby slept, or the sun rises, those thoughts are perfectly complete. The action doesn't transfer to anything, it just exists. These are finished, independent statements, driven entirely by intransitive verbs.
And here's where it gets really fascinating. Context is literally everything here. I read a book clearly transfers action, so it's transitive. But if you're just stating your hobby and say, I read, that stands entirely alone as an intransitive verb. Same word, totally different grammatical job, depending on the context.
All right, Section 3, Active and Passive Voice.
To really grasp how verbs shift our focus, we need to talk about voice. This basically describes the core relationship between the verb and the subject. It tells us who's holding the camera, so to speak, and where exactly the lens is pointing.
Take a phrase like, the chef cooked the meal. The actor, the chef, is right up front, driving the action. But if we flip it to, the meal was cooked by the chef, it is the exact same event, but the spotlight completely shifts over to the object receiving the action.
So, with the active voice, the subject actively does the action. And honestly, this is hands down the strongest, most direct way you can write. If you want your writing to be punchy, clear, and confident, active voice is definitely your best friend.
But if the thing receiving the action is what actually matters most, that's when we shift to passive voice. You can usually spot it because it uses a to be verb paired up with a past participle, like, the meal was cooked. This is actually a brilliant strategic tool when you want to emphasize the end result, or, sometimes creatively evade mentioning who actually did the action.
Finally, we arrive at Section 4, Verbs in Disguise.
This is where we get into verbals, which are just so cool. Basically, these are words built out of verbs that temporarily ditch their action verb day job. They put on a trench coat and sunglasses, step right out of the verb slot in a sentence, and start functioning entirely as nouns, adjectives, or adverbs.
They basically have three go-to disguises. First, gerunds. They tack on an ing to hijack the noun slot, like in the phrase, swimming is great exercise. Then you have participles, which step in as adjectives, like describing a crying baby.
And finally, infinitives, which use to plus a verb, like to travel. These are the ultimate shapeshifters, stepping in wherever the sentence happens to need them.
So, what does this all mean for us? Well, the next time you're drafting an email, writing a report, or telling a story, take a closer look at your sentences. Who's really pulling the strings? Are your verbs confidently driving the action? Are they intentionally shifting the focus? Or are they sneaking around in a clever disguise? Once you realize the secret life your verbs are leading, how will you choose to command them?